Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talk Gaming Extras. This is the show where I try to talk about stuff that I normally wouldn't get to talk about in a normal scripted video, for instance, topics that generally require a little bit more time and a little bit more rambling, as though I don't do enough of that. So this video is mainly intended to just talk about those longer form subjects and get all of this information out there and start a dialogue, not just between me and the ether, but between me and you. So I want to hear your thoughts on these topics in the comment section below. I will read them. And as we go through, I'm going to be referencing comments and things that other viewers have said in the past. And the idea is that we just create a larger discussion on the whole. So that's what we're going for. And it's very podcast styled. So do not feel as though you need to watch the video. Go ahead, turn something on, play it, listen to this in the background or on a drive. No need to really watch the video. There's not going to be anything particularly pertinent as we go through this. It's mainly just a dialogue above and beyond anything else. So with that said, what are we talking about today? Well, today we're going to be addressing basically narratives in gaming. And this is a topic which, of course, you can go on ad nauseum if you desired, because it is so broad and there are many conflicting opinions at its core. Because when you're discussing successful narratives in games, of course, many games could come to the forefront of your mind. Obviously, the gameplay I'm showing was very specific. It's a sequence from The Last of Us Left Behind DLC. This is a game that obviously is very successful at communicating its story in an effective way. The story itself is not particularly creative. It's a fairly normal story that many people have heard before in many different forms, but it's the way it's told and communicated to the player that makes it so unique and special, and more importantly than anything else, successful. So you can have a brilliant story that's reinventive and is fantastic, but if you can't communicate it to your viewer or to the audience, it's no good. It's a waste of time. And so where The Last of Us excelled was in the way that it actually successfully made players feel the emotions that Naughty Dog wanted players to feel, and the way that they were able to get you emotionally invested in these characters that are only on screen for a matter of hours instead of real people that you tend to deal with for days, weeks, months, even years. So with that in mind, we can look at The Last of Us as a sort of analog, as a center, and try to build off of it from there and look at what they did well that other games could seek to plagiarize. And in this case, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the standard of art, as many people have said. I'm not sure if there's even one person directly to quote on it, but the idea that nothing is new, it's simply the medium and the way at which you approach it and the perspective specifically that is new. So it's sort of the postmodern art movement, very similar to the idea in modern theater, modern staging, which of course one of my passions outside of just video games and YouTube and tech in general is theater. I love performing on stage and doing plays and musicals, believe it or not. And one of the things that you study and you learn while going through and performing these plays is that most of the stories that you are telling as an actor are the same stories at their core that have been told for centuries, that have been told for millennia even. And what's different is the way that they're being told. It's the perspective. So if we're telling a story of loss and heartache between a father who feels as though he's failing his family and has to take drastic steps to provide, that's a story that is millennia old. It's the way in which it's told that separates it out, that turns it from an old play written by somebody in Greece thousands of years ago into, for instance, Breaking Bad. And so there's ways that you can twist the story and develop it where it is unique, even though at its core it is a very old human tale, if all of that makes sense. And in regards to plays and staging of plays, even if we're looking at a more medium approach to how things are done, if you look at like a staging of, for instance, Frankenstein, let's use that. Frankenstein was recently performed on Broadway by Benedict Cumberbatch and another individual whose name I cannot remember at the moment. And in that staging, of course, Frankenstein has been performed multiple times. It's a story that is well known, and the way that it was told had to be different. And to create a fresh retelling of the same story that people know took a little reinvention, took the melding of multiple other stories and multiple other narratives, if you will, and required them to be melded together. And there's ways that that can be done in order for it to be truly successful. And when it's done successfully, of course, you end up with a show like they had on Broadway when they performed that new version of Frankenstein. So it's all about reframing and doing things a little bit differently and taking those risks. Now, with The Last of Us, of course, there were things that were done that people didn't really think, especially the developers, did not expect to work or be successful. If you listen to interviews by Neil Druckmann, the creative director behind The Last of Us and sort of the brains behind the machine, he said up until about a month out from release, they really were not sure if The Last of Us was going to be successful or if it was going to doom their company. It really was one of those moments where they had no idea how it would be, how people would respond to it, how it would be taken. There was no way of knowing. It was completely up in the air because it was different. And looking back on it now, it seems kind of obvious, like, oh, of course The Last of Us was going to be successful. It's a deep narrative story, but it's told in this beautiful way, and the gameplay isn't particularly amazing, but it's economical and it works. It's done in a very intentional way, so every gameplay sequence is used not just to occupy some time in the run through, you know, this sort of obligatory gameplay that you often see in narrative titles, but rather the gameplay is used to help communicate the story. You know, when you're digging through and you find, and you're searching through a body and you find a postcard with a picture on it and a note on the back, that's not just an item as a little collectible. That's a very intentional object that's set there to help communicate an emotion and a mood and a feeling that builds into the greater context and emotion that they want you to be feeling as you go through that sequence. Everything is very, very intentional. So now, of course, it makes sense that it was going to be successful and that it was going to work. But at the time, it wasn't necessarily that way. And if we look at specifically how The Last of Us built their narrative, it's very interesting because it developed quite slowly and it wasn't always going to remain the same. So if you watch the behind the scenes clips from the development of The Last of Us, originally Ellie, for instance, was not going to be very helpful in combat. She was going to basically go hide in a corner while Joel smacked some people around and tried to fight him. However, as they were going through this, Ashley Johnson, the woman who plays Ellie in the motion capture and the voiceover, she said while they were doing the motion capture, I feel like I would get in there. I feel like I would get in there and fight him. I don't think Ellie would just sit by and not do anything. And so Neil Druckmann said, okay, let's go for it. Let's try it. And they filmed the scene. And this ended up being the scene where the truck is ambushed by a bunch of raiders. And of course, in the final game, Ellie gets in there and actually tries stabbing a guy. She gets in there. She actually is helpful. And in that moment, that gameplay helps build the relationship between Joel and Ellie. So it actually adds to the narrative in the gameplay side of things. And this is something that they slowly discovered as they went through. And I always want to stress this because I think it's important. People always assume that when a game or when a story, a movie, a book, anything like that, when it's incredibly successful, they assume that it was some sort of master plan, that from the very beginning, the creator of this piece of art knew exactly what they were doing and knew exactly that it would have this impact. And it was this great, forethought that drove this innovation. And that, frankly, is almost never true. If you listen to Stephen King talk about the writing process for It and The Shining, he communicates very clearly, I was really tired when I was writing this. It was written mostly in a cocaine-fueled high state, and when you read the actual book, that makes a lot of sense. And it was a bit of a blur for him, but of course it eventually evolved into something fairly fantastic. And it wasn't purely intentional. He just let his consciousness sort of flow onto the page, and people responded to it and people liked it. And in the case of The Last of Us, they didn't know that all of this was going to be so successful, but they just took a risk and they put it out there. Now, I don't want to say that, of course, being successful in a narrative sense is purely luck and it's just a matter of trying new stuff and hoping that it works, because it's not really that way. There are some tried and true ways that you can enhance your story in the game. There's some tried and true ways that you can improve the way that your story is communicated. And this, of course, goes from everything from having what we call an IV drip of exposition, where you don't reveal things too quickly. One of the big issues with crappy writing, not just in video games, but also just in general, whether it's in a novel or it's in a play or what have you, is people tend to write a lot and they tend to exposit a lot. And as a result of that, the player gets overwhelmed with information and they just kind of shut down. They stop listening to what's going on because it's just overwhelming. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't keep up with it. So in the case of The Last of Us, they don't do much to explain exactly what's going on. If you go back through and you look at the first 20, 25 minutes of the game, not much is clearly communicated to you in the way of like, oh my gosh, there are zombies here and now we have to run and the poison is transmitted through bites and blah, blah, blah. They don't do that. They leave that to your imagination because they don't need to explain all of that. The characters likely don't know of all of that. And even if they do know all of that, they're not going to casually be chatting after living in this reality for years and years about how the actual toxin is transmitted. It just wouldn't make sense. And that's the idea, is that you can excuse a lot of exposition in the sense that sometimes characters need information, but when in doubt, just leave it. Leave the audience to figure that out for themselves and piece it together, because often the imagination does a much better job of filling in the gaps than your writing ability will be able to fill in those gaps. And you see that in The Last of Us. You see that in all the greatest, books, novels, plays, what have you, that you read. They don't try to explain every single little thing. They leave a lot of it to your imagination, because your imagination will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Again, to go back to the example of It, just because I have it on the brain, you look at that. They don't go into crazy exposition of where this great evil comes from. In the book, it gets much more detailed, of course, than in the films or in the miniseries. But in general, they don't feel the need to stress all of these little details because it's frankly not important. And you can see that, even if you look at the book, of course, it's a book, so they have much more space, and Stephen King had much more space to explain things. But if you compare it to the film, they didn't need to explain all of that. They don't need to explain how the universe is floating on the back of a magical turtle in space-time, which, yes, that is the actual narrative plot in Stephen King's universes. Look it up. It's insane. That's why there's turtles all throughout the game. It's I won't get into that because it's a bit of a side note. But regardless, they don't go in, they don't stress, they don't explain it, and people weren't leaving the movie saying, oh, that didn't make sense because I don't know how the universe operates in this. They just know there's a scary clown that's doing creepy stuff and that it's terrifying. And it's still enjoyable, and they still care about the characters in the world, and they have bought into it because it was portrayed in a proper way. And so you don't always need to explain everything super clearly. Sometimes you need to leave it up to the imagination of the player and the viewer in general. And that's one of the great things about video games on the whole, is that you can do that, is that you can leave all of this to the player's imagination, and they will fill in the gaps either while they play through the game or as they get to know this world that you've crafted for them. And that's something that really is not true of any other medium. You can sit in a film and not get explained all of and not have everything explained to you, and then you can sort of piece things together, but you're only in that world for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and that's it. Then you're out and you're done. In a video game, you're talking anywhere from 10, 12, 13 hours to a game like Persona 5, which requires at least 95 hours to get through the main quest. There's all of these games which offer basically huge experiences and require you to buy into their world completely in order to get to know it. And that's something that only video games can really do. It's something unique to this industry. Now, to go back to other tried and true ways that you can improve the narrative on the whole, of course, there's things like not necessarily assuming your audience, which is more specific to RPG storytelling. You know, when you're playing through Fallout New Vegas, if you're coming into Fallout New Vegas with knowledge of the Fallout universe, it's going to make a little bit more sense than somebody who has never played through any Fallout game before and has no previous exposure to the series. So the way you have to frame the world and frame the characters is a little bit different when you take into consideration that some of the people playing this may have no exposure. Now, the reality is it's safe to assume that people who are playing Fallout New Vegas likely have previous exposure to the series. If you are playing through, for instance, the upcoming God of War, chances are you have some knowledge of Kratos, but probably not as much as somebody who's playing through for instance, Elder Scrolls 6, whenever that eventually comes out. It's an assumption that can be made just because of the industry that we are in. Other things that can also add on to the overall experience in the narrative can be everything from the voice acting as well. We saw how important this was in Mass Effect Andromeda. If it's done poorly, the player completely backs out. Animation systems can be very important. We see that in Naughty Dog games. Uncharted 4, some of the best hand-keyed animation sequences you will ever see in a video game come out of that studio, and they absolutely nail it every single time that they attempt it. And because of that, you can buy in much more to the world that's in front of you, and it's because it's much more realistic. Now, does every game need to be realistic for you to buy into it? No, not necessarily. And of course, there's games such as many JRPGs that almost laugh at the sentiment of things being realistic and embrace the complete antithesis of that, and they can still be engaging. A game like Persona 5 is absolutely not as realistic and as grounded as a game like The Last of Us or Uncharted 4, nor should it be. They're aimed at completely different audiences, and they're trying to do completely different things, and that's good. That's great. But once again, because they can aim at different things, such as focusing on the characters, focusing on how the characters are developed, making sure that they have personalities and aren't just sort of archetypes of people that are there to explain things to you. And more than anything, I think that that is at the core of good video game writing specifically. Because this is an interactive medium, we're dealing with characters that can be interacted with. And to what degree they're interacted with, of course, is completely dependent on the particular game or the developer. In The Last of Us, you aren't changing anybody's mind. You aren't changing the world necessarily. You're on a very strict schedule and path that the developer has set out for you. But you are still talking with these characters. You're solving problems with these characters, and you're going through this dystopian world with these characters. Dystopian probably isn't the best word for that, but you get what I'm saying. And so you build a bond, you build a relationship with them, and that's something that only video games can do. That's why so often when we look at video game movies, such as the new Tomb Raider, which just came out, often they can be a little disappointing because we have gotten to know these characters in a very, very specific way, and that's because we built relationships with them in an interactive fashion and by means of interactivity. And when you transfer that into a non-interactive medium, it doesn't work very well, which is why so often video game movies tend to suck. Not just because often they're written poorly, but also just because the mediums are, or medii medium, whatever the word would be, are completely different. They're just not the same. Now, all of this to say, especially moving in, and part of what spawned this video was the coming God of War, which many people have spoken about its similarities and its attempt to mimic some of the storytelling that The Last of Us employed. And it's a complete turnaround for the franchise, of course. God of War previously has been a very, very action-focused title, and it didn't try to make a narrative, or the narrative, its primary focus, even though Kratos does have an interesting story that could have been a double down on. It just wasn't a focus. It wasn't the priority, because that just wasn't what they were going for. But now they see what they could achieve, and they're owning it. And I think that that's phenomenal, because the potential certainly is there. And as we've already seen, the new game is building two characters, Kratos and his son, as the protagonists of the game. And as they go through this world, they're going to be solving problems together. They're going to be fighting these giant beasts together. They're going to be doing things together and bonding. And as a result, the player is going to be bonding with those characters, which means whatever happens later in the game is going to hit home much harder, because they've had this interactive experience bonding with not just one, but two characters in this way. And I can already foresee the new God of War being truly phenomenal, especially because we're talking about a Sony studio, and Sony, of course, has multiple meetings throughout the year where they actually have the game directors of from these different companies meet up and share ideas. And I frankly can't wait. I think it will be truly phenomenal. But that's just me. And this has been just, as I said, just a kind of off the dome, real-time discussion where I just want to share some of my thoughts on these questions. I do get questions like these, and it's fun just to go through and answer them and just sort of blather on about them, because I think that there's a lot of interesting dialogue that can come as a result of them. But I want to hear your thoughts on all of this. What games and what narratives have really stood out to you? And I want to know why they stood out to you. You will likely have input way beyond what I was able to articulate here, and I'd love to hear that. And I'm sure many other people who are watching this video or listening to this video would be interested in hearing that as well, as we all scroll through the comments. So go ahead and leave those down below. I can't wait to read them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming out. I love each and every single one of you, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.